So Eddie Van Halen's on record saying that Randy Rhoads, quote, learned everything from me, unquote, or words to that effect. And right now I'd like to talk about whether or not that's true. Eddie was convinced that most of the guitar players in the late 70s and 1980s were influenced by him and his technique and sound, and for the most part, he's right. You can barely think of a guitar player who wasn't deeply moved by Eddie's tone and his two-handed tapping technique. On the other hand, Eddie's gargantuan shadow didn't stop many guitar players from developing their own identity. I would say that players like George Lynch, Michael Schenker, and even someone off on the cusp of experimentation like Steve Stevens had distinctive sounds in that same era that really didn't have a whole lot to do with Eddie Van Halen. We could mention also players like The Edge, but for now let's just keep it to the hard rock and heavy metal sector with a direct comparison between Eddie Van Halen and Randy Rhoads. In my opinion, there are three areas to keep in mind when determining if Eddie's statement is true. First is how Randy played in the studio. What was his approach to songwriting and what was his approach to recording? If you go back and listen to Blizzard of Oz and Diary of a Madman, they differ greatly from the sound of the Van Halen albums. Yes, there's similarities in the approach to the guitar, particularly in terms of using a phaser and combining rhythm and lead as a synthesis. But in the studio, Randy is much more in service of the band sound than Eddie. Eddie steamrolls over Van Halen with the other members desperately trying to keep up, including Alex and including Dave. When you listen to Blizzard of Oz album, you can hear that it was originally supposed to be a band called Blizzard of Oz and not an Ozzy solo album, because the strength of the album is the band sound, the songwriting, the contributions of Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake. So in this regard, I don't think he was deeply influenced by Van Halen at all. The second thing to talk about is his technique. On one hand, you can hear a lot of Eddie influence in what Randy does. He's playful, he's inventive, he stretches the parameters of what the guitar can do in its non-musical capacities, using switches and manipulation of the whammy bar and different elements of just manhandling the guitar to get different sounds out of it. At the same time, one of the most distinctive and overwhelmingly identifiable aspects of Eddie's playing is the tapping technique. While Randy does use it, and in some cases he uses it in a direct echo of the way that Eddie does, tapping isn't that big of a part of Randy's sound. In fact, soloing isn't that big of a part of Randy's sound. He does a lot with rhythm guitar, as does Eddie, but his approach toward the rhythm guitar is different than Eddie's. Eddie has a really loose right wrist, and he's got this infectious, groovy, but at the same time laid back approach. Randy is more like a classical guitarist, with every note falling perfectly into place, smoothness, his legato picking. In one way, you might say Eddie's sound is a little bit more rock and rollish, while Randy's sound is a bit more polished and, I would say, cinematic. Brings us to the third and final point. In terms of guitar solos, are they the same? Well, Eddie tends to play a lot of really fast, intricate building solos that take the song in an entirely new direction. If you look at something like Hot for Teacher or even a song like Panama, the solo section is almost like a separate instrumental aspect of the song. It is a chance for Eddie to burn and show what he can do. He's like a man playing with, an extra set of fingers. When you listen to something like Revelation Mother Earth or Can't Kill Rock and Roll, there is a melodic sense that is predominant. It takes over the technique, and Randy's technique is muted compared to his compositional technique. So this is the biggest difference that I see between the two. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that Randy Rhoads was a better guitar player, I'm not saying he was a better songwriter. I'm saying that Eddie's statement that Randy learned everything from him is mistaken. Randy, like all other guitarists that heard Eddie, was deeply influenced by the gates that Eddie opened, but he was able to carve out a distinctive signature sound that owes a little bit to Eddie, but really is all his own. So please leave a comment in the section below, and remember to like and subscribe. Thanks a lot.